Hello, this is a presentation on the science of persuasion, using persuasion principles and techniques in food security, child survival, and other community development programs. This is part 2 of a series on social proof and reciprocation. This presentation is brought to you by the Food Security Nutrition Network and the TOPS Project. I am Tom Davis. I'm the TOPS Senior Specialist for Social and Behavior Change and also the Senior Director of Program Quality Improvement for Food for the Hungry. This is part 2 of a series on the science of persuasion. If you have not heard part 1 on commitment and consistency, 2 other principles of persuasion, you may want to see that presentation first by clicking on the link below, or at least listen to the introductory slides in this presentation, which includes some important lessons learned about behavior change, which were included in that first presentation. Please click on one of the 2 options below, either to continue with the introduction and overview of behavior change, which I suggest if you've not already heard that during the first presentation, or to skip the introduction and overview to go directly to the new information that wasn't covered in the first presentation. Let's start by talking about our niche. We, PVOs and NGOs, will probably not develop the next great vaccine or medicine. However, we may and should develop and discover the best community mobilization and behavior change approaches. We can also innovate and test them, and we need to know the literature, what works in the lab in order to do that. Some replication of these studies that we'll be talking about have been done in developing countries, and we'll talk a bit about that further in a minute. Most of the studies that I'll cite during this presentation are from industrialized countries, but these are very universal principles that we're talking about that have been tested to some degree in developing countries and that we expect to operate and be operational in developing countries where we work. So the science of persuasion, these are, what I'm going to be talking about are principles from decades of social psychology research, much of it from earlier decades. It's been used by community organizers, advertisers, social marketers, politicians, and to some degree, really not enough, by people promoting behavior change in food security and child survival and other community development programs. There are several classic books that summarize the data, such as Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, The Human Connection and Fostering Sustainable Behavior by Mackenzie Moore and Smith. Data from careful observation and experimentation has also been used to come up with these. It's not just conjecture or personal techniques. When you read these books, you realize that a lot of research has gone into coming up with these techniques and principles. It is a relatively young discipline in terms of using the experimental approach, but it is, these are well-proven principles that we'll be talking about. So persuasion literature answers questions about what kinds of messages are most memorable and persuasive, what techniques or actions make people more likely to respond positively to a request, how we're influenced and how we influence others, how we decide who we are, that is our identity, and what we should do, how and when we look to others to know what to do, and also a lot of information about the effectiveness of incentives and the types of incentives that work. Some of these findings can be applied in our work in promoting behavior change as well as in community mobilization. And that's why I feel like we should all be versed in what the science of persuasion is telling us. So when do we persuade? Well, what are the things that we try to persuade people to do in our programs? Think about that. There are things like household level and on-farm behavior change, where we ask people to adopt a new practice, for example. Also, community level mobilization and change. Service utilization, like use of health facilities or financial services, where we're asking people to use a service that's available to them, and we try to persuade them to do so. And also making subcommitments, like agreeing to attend a meeting. Now, these are a lot of the things that we ask people to do. You always need to look at the other side and see, are we asking people to do the right things? And are those things like a service, for example? Sometimes what we'll learn from talking with people is that the service needs to change before we can persuade people to use a service. We have other tools for that. This is thinking more about when we know what we'd like people to do and we're fairly certain it fits with what people need and want, then how do we persuade them to adopt that behavior? So persuasion is a part of behavior change. Before you can maintain a behavior, you have to be persuaded to come hear about it, be persuaded to try it out, and then be persuaded to give it a chance, like repeating the behavior or trying to do something a bit more intensive than maybe you've done in the past. Now, I did talk to Dr. Cialdini, who wrote about a lot of these. I asked him about the application of these in developing countries. He said that he considers these principles to be human universals, but he sent me some studies showing that the strength of each and applicability of the different principles does vary across cultures. In cultures and people that are more collectivistic, the relationally based principles like social proof and liking will probably be a lot stronger than some of the individually based principles like commitment and consistency and authority. Still, all the evidence to date shows that these principles apply across cultures, just in varying degrees. There are 7 main principles of persuasion that are mentioned in the literature. There's the principle of commitment and consistency, which was the topic of the first narrated presentation. Social proof, reciprocation, contrast, liking, authority, scarcity. Also, internal and external attribution is mentioned some. And we will be focusing on the second and third ones during this presentation, social proof and reciprocation. Note that all of these can be used for both good and evil. As we go through some of these examples, you might hear an example where you felt like what they were asking someone to do was a bit coercive or something that they shouldn't have asked someone to do. On the other hand, you might hear of a principle where the example was something very positive, but you can see a way that it could be used to convince someone to do something that they shouldn't do or that they really wouldn't want to do if they thought through it very much. I consider these principles amoral, basically not immoral, but without morality, and that it depends how you use them, whether they're good or not. And I think that's true of most of the ways that we try to convince people to adopt behaviors. We have to think about ethics when we're doing that. But then not reject any technique out of hand, but say, how is this going to be used and for what purpose, and decide in that context whether it's the right method to use or not. Let's talk a little bit about what we know doesn't work very well in behavior change. And some of this is taken from an excellent book called Change or Die by Dutchman. And what this author found was the title of the book comes from where he had found that physicians would often tell people, if you don't change your lifestyle and what you're eating and how you're exercising, you will die from the heart condition you have. And a surprising percentage of people did not change. And that just shows you the limitations of the fear drive model, which is what we use for a long time in a lot of health promotion and in other fields to get people to make changes. It's very limited. And he sums it up to the 3 F's about what doesn't work very well in terms of achieving behavior change. One is facts, that is fear only. For example, just telling farmers that they can increase their yield if they use a new farming technique, or telling mothers how malaria is transmitted. That alone often will not bring about that much behavior change. Secondly, fear. For example, making people more afraid that their crops could become diseased by a particular disease or pest, or more fear of human diseases without improving their prevention skills. That fear alone often will do very little. And force. For example, having leaders tell people that they simply have to change and relying on their moral authority of that position or their expertise, or even setting laws on something like latrine ownership, where you're trying to force people into compliance. When you don't have a way to make consistent and permanent enforcement possible, that often just fails. So what does work in terms of promoting behavior change? Well, one is developing a relationship with someone you trust who gives you hope for change. I think this is one of the reasons for the success of block leaders in things like care groups, for example. Harper and Nielsen looked at one study I was looking at. They looked at households that received a visit by a volunteer block leader in the U.S., and that they recycled nearly a third more often than households who received prompts. For example, a few days before the recycling day, they reminded them to do it. And 3 times as often as homes that received flyers about recycling. These volunteer block leaders were more effective in changing behavior, but they alone had an impact on norms and beliefs as well. In comparing survey results from before and after this campaign to increase recycling, the households that were visited by a block leader were more likely to report that they felt upset if they discarded recycling materials and that they felt an obligation to recycle those materials. Prompts and information strategies had very little effect on those beliefs and feelings. When people are asked to change their behavior or adopt a new lifestyle, behavioral research suggests that direct contact in which social norms, modeling, and social diffusion occur are particularly important. And that's from a paper by Aronson O'Leary in 1983. So we need to remember that this relationship with someone is really key. Our work needs to be relational. Also, learning and practice skills that you need to make a change, like role playing. Sometimes when we're asking someone to try something out, think especially about transactional skills. If we wanted to help someone to avoid AIDS and they need to talk to their partner, you better have them role playing and practicing that because it's something they might only get one shot at. And if it fails miserably, they might not try again. So learning how to do things, practicing skills work. Same thing has been done with teaching people to cook in a way that they could reduce their heart disease. I mean, you can give them all sorts of pamphlets on that, but they really need to practice some of the skills you're teaching them to learn it. Also, changing our worldview or reframing, looking at things in a new way is one thing that seems to work in promoting behavior change. And focusing on determinants of the behavior. So when we do research like do or non-doer studies, barrier analysis, other tools to help us know why are people doing or not doing a particular behavior, then knowing those determinants, you can then focus on them. Maybe with a particular practice you're promoting, it's self-efficacy. It says the person feel like they're able to do this. Or in another one, maybe it's perceived social norms. Maybe they feel like they could do it, but they feel like that one of their family members is going to be very displeased with them if they start doing it. So you need to know what those determinants are and then focus on them. One of the reasons we believe that care groups are outperforming a lot of other models in terms of behavior change and also bringing down the under 5 mortality rate is use of block leaders. We talked about the importance of that. This graph shows that the mortality reduction in 13 projects, some using care groups in 8 countries based on the Bellagio Lives Saved calculator. Note that there is up to a 64 to 242% higher reduction in this mortality rate in all but 2 of these programs using these block leaders than the average Child Survival and Health Grants project. And 11 of the 13 projects outperform the average under 5 mortality reduction. And that 14% reduction of the average Child Survival project is nothing to sneeze at. This average is a very good mortality reduction. And of course, that would vary from year to year. We just picked a particular set of years to look at what the average was, but some years that has been higher, some it's been lower. This graph shows by how much care group projects outperform the average Child Survival and Health Grants Program project in terms of rapid catch indicators, the main indicators that have been looked at for years to track some of the performance of these projects. The indicators have changed over the years, but these care group projects outperform the average in terms of gap closure and underweight, with an average gap closure of 32% versus the 26% child survival average. So closing almost a third of that gap. So a real nice change. And across this, you can see that for most of these indicators, they had a better result when they were using a trusted person who's visiting a neighbor. So that's one key thing I think we need to remember in terms of persuasion. Who is asking this person to change? And when you have neighbors suggesting that I would like to have this person be the one that comes to my household and works with me, when they choose that care group volunteer, it really boosts the possibility for change no matter what sort of persuasion technique is used. Now let's go ahead and talk about something up front. As I've taught this in the past, often we hear people say, these techniques wouldn't work on me. And maybe it's true that some of these wouldn't work on you all of the time, but I do not doubt that they wouldn't work on you some of the time. And just because they also wouldn't work on you a lot of the time doesn't mean it doesn't work on a lot of people a lot of the time. And part of understanding that is understanding that there are 2 routes to persuasion. This is taken from Communication to Persuasion, the Central and Peripheral Routes, and Attitude Change. I've got the reference down there below. So it's important to know that we use these 2 different routes depending on the context and time and other factors. There's a term that's been used in the popular literature dealing with this called wattage, which is what is our willingness and ability to think in a given moment when we have to make a decision. One of the routes is called the central route. This is when you're high wattage, you have a high willingness and ability to think. You're thinking carefully and with a lot of effort. It's characterized by being active, creative, you're alert. This is kind of your 10 a.m. thinking, usually, at least for people that are morning people. We have a longer conversation in our heads that contain topical, relevant thoughts like health decisions for health people often go that central route. We're being very analytical about it. Central thinkers and people doing central thinking look for facts, evidence, and examples and use a lot of reasoning and logic. An example of that, let's say this is a good day and you're at the supermarket trying to decide what to buy. It's 10 a.m. on Saturday. You're looking at all the jars of spaghetti sauce and you're by yourself scanning the shelves with the cold calculating eye of a poker champion. You consider one and think, wow, Look at the sodium content in that one. And if I get Alfredo sauce, then I'm going to lose all the lycopene benefits. And what's the cost per ounce of that one anyway? Man, I could buy a pack of tomatoes for the price for that one. So maybe I should just make it from scratch. But then who knows what pesticides they use on the fresh tomatoes. So we all have this ongoing conversation in our heads. It's sometimes longer, sometimes short. But there are times at which it's relevant, sharp, focused, balanced, analytical, articulated, and thorough. And when that happens, that's central root thinking. And despite how much you do it, don't assume that most people do it on every issue, or that even you do it on every issue. So some of the characteristics of the central root thinking, decisions made using this route are more persistent over time, they are more resistant to counter-arguments, and they're more predictive of future behaviors. But everyone is not high wattage all the time, and they're not using this central root thinking at all times and in all issues. Okay, let's talk about the other route. This is the peripheral route. This is when you're more low wattage, you have a low willingness and ability to think, when you're tired, busy, or passive. It's often a shorter conversation that happens in our heads. Think of it like your 4 p.m. thinking, or thinking about how we, food security people or people that work in community development, think about investing our money. Maybe some of you think a lot about that, but for a lot of people, it's the last thing you're thinking about is your retirement account. Instead, you're really focused on the present and what you're doing. So with the peripheral route, attractiveness, friendliness, or expertise of the source are usually a lot more influential. As an example of that, peripheral route thinking, this is what we use on the bad day. So you're in a new store, a new grocery store at 6:30 p.m., you have 3 kids with you who like to play the let's put everything in the grocery cart game, and they consider the cart an amusement ride and argue about who gets to be in what part of it. You're sick of writing proposals, your feet are killing you, and then you find a shelf with many different brands, prices, and sizes of spaghetti sauce, and you grab one saying, Paul Newman Socceroni. Well, that's a funny name. Hey, remember Paul Newman in The Sting? That was a good movie. I'll just get that one. So that's the peripheral route. There's not a lot of detailed analysis, but something drew you to that particular product, and it wasn't logic or analysis. Remember, just because the conversation is short doesn't mean that it's peripheral. You may think, they all taste the same to me, so I'm just going to buy the cheapest brand. That's a very short conversation in your head, but it's analytical and it's central root thinking. And sometimes that central root thinking really just cuts to the chase. We're more likely to use a central route when the issue has a strong relevance for us. When it's something that may not be our top priority about things to think about, that we have opinions about, we'll be more likely to default to that peripheral route. Both routes can lead to the same amount of immediate change. And there are ways that you can try to help people to increase their wattage so that they get into that central route thinking when they're making the decision. Some ways of doing that are things like demonstrating the relevance of the issue to the person. But it's usually best to focus on using approaches that work on low wattage thinkers rather than trying to just increase everyone's wattage and trying to make everyone think this is a life or death issue. Now we're going to talk about it. We have to take people where they are usually. Okay, so when to use what? Well, for someone who's using central root thinking, thoughtful persuasion works best. Using facts, evidence, examples, reasoning, and logic will often do the trick. And it's often what we default to, is providing this sort of information in our behavior change materials and the lesson plans we create. But for someone who's using that peripheral route thinking, this term Clark's worked best. That's contrast, liking, authority, reciprocity, commitment and consistency, scarcity, and social proof. We talked about 2 of those in the last presentation, and we'll talk about social proof and reciprocity during this one. So focusing on these Clarks to fill out our toolbox is helpful. Our default mode is working on that central route persuasion, but we often need to have both to get the job done. And if we can combine the two, often we'll see the best results.